Hello, everyone. We are live with you guys. Thank you again for joining us for our very first episode of the Truffle Webinar Series. Yes, there will be a recording available. We're recording this whole thing. In fact, at the end, we'll have questions and answer session, and we're actually going to record the response to each question. So if you just want to review the response to questions, you can also do that, or you can have a recording of the whole thing today. So yes, thank you again for joining us. We are talking about exploring the full life cycle of developing and deploying a Dapp, which is a very exciting thing to learn these days with blockchain. Whether you're beginner, intermediate, or advanced, this is going to be great for you guys. We're really going to explore the full life cycle and make sure you guys feel comfortable with all the tools that we recommend to really streamline the process, to really give you the confidence to deploy your dApps, create dApps, and make sure that you feel like you understand what you're doing and why. So this episode, we are going to be walked through all of this by our lovely hosts, Kevin and Amal. They are great skilled men in this arena. And so they're very, very seasoned on helping you guys understand this topic. So before we get started, though, and before I hand over the mic, just a little housekeeping around Crowdcast. I don't know if anybody's new to Crowdcast, but if you are, just to give you a heads up, you can, of course, as you're using the chat to your right, you can chat away there, and I'll kind of keep an eye on that while they're going through the webinar. But if you have any questions that you'd like them to answer, please queue them up in the Ask a Question. You just click on that button. You can load up your question. You can actually ask the question in the chat, and then a little bubble will pop up and say, do you want to add this as a question? You can do it that way as well. And then and at the end, we'll have time to actually go through and answer those questions. Now, a lot of those questions, if you see one that someone else has asked that you have the same question, upvote that so that Kevin and Amal know that this is an important question to answer that a few of you might want to know rather than just a single. Also, we have some polls. If you've already answered those, thank you very much. If you haven't yet, please quickly go answer the questions in the polls. That helps Kevin and Amal understand your experience level and what information you might need, and that'll be most helpful to you guys. And then finally, we have a call to action there that says register for TruffleCon 2020. We are super excited to have you guys join us this year. The topics we're going to be talking about in these webinars, you'll only be able to expand on if you attend TruffleCon this year. So we really encourage you to click on that registration button and get a ticket if you haven't already. It's free, but there is an option for a VIP experience and a truffle chocolate tasting flight, which is pretty fantastic. It's pretty unique to our conference. So you can grab one of those two only until October 1st. So get those now. And we have a special incentive if you register for a VIP experience on this webinar. I'll kind of come back to that after a few. So again, thank you for being here, and I will hand the mic over to Kevin and Amal.
Sorry, I was just sending one last message in the chat there. Cool. Well, thank you, Shay. Awesome to be here. And yeah, as Shay mentioned, this series, because it's going to be 5 parts or 5 episodes, is going to be all about exploring the full life cycle of deploying, developing, and many other things related to a decentralized application. So let's jump in. So yeah, just briefly about myself and Amal, I'll start. So my name is Kevin Bluer. I'm the head of training and ecosystem engineering here at Truffle. So that manifests in, as it sounds, training, working with the ecosystem, working on our tools, etc. And with that, I'll hand over to Amal to introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Amal Sudama. I'm a blockchain tools developer. And I love onboarding new developers to the ecosystem. Kevin?
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Amal. Cool. All right. So yeah, just before we kind of jump into this episode, we just wanted to frame the series itself. As mentioned, it's going to be 5 parts, 5 episodes. As I mentioned already, the goal of the episode of the series is really to get deep into the complete development application. Development lifecycle for a decentralized app or DApp. And we'll do that by getting hands-on, predominantly hands-on, most of these sessions, other than today, which is going to be a bit more theory, although we'll be hands-on as well. And just to give a little bit of the background, just kind of what led us to come up with this as a theme. If you can see on the slide here, we've got the kind of full life cycle, pretty sort of general software development life cycle. And as a suite of tools, we have historically been on the left. So everything around the planning, the writing the code, the compilation, the building, writing tests, running tests, and to some degree, the pieces on the right as well. However, as the paradigm has evolved and matured, the need for a kind of more robust story on the right-hand side, almost like we often think of this as like dev being on the left and then ops being on the right, has really started to come to the fore. So things like a more robust release management process. Similarly, the ability to more thoroughly monitor the things that you've deployed to a given network. And that's actually now something, in the good news sense, something we have a really strong story for in a tool called Truffle Teams. So given that we now have both parts of the lifecycle covered, we figured it would be why not, let's do a series where we really get deep into the entire lifecycle. Anything to add there, Amal?
Yeah, I think it's if you guys are familiar with the ecosystem, it's been exciting. Newer and newer tools are coming out, and we're getting to the point where we need a more sophisticated plan and like DevOps, which this diagram shows. So we're going to cover that in the series, and I'm really excited to share it with you.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Amal. So in terms of the roadmap for the series, just brief, we're going to be kind of iterating on a little bit of ourselves, but we're roughly, and emphasis on roughly, going to be following the life cycle. So we've got another kind of variation of that same diagram here on this slide, and we've kind of loosely, or will be loosely mapping the different stages in the life cycle to different episodes or different weeks. Big caveat that it's not going to be completely linear. So it's not like, oh, this week we're now explicitly kind of only doing this. For example, even this week, when we get to the kind of hands-on piece, we'll be actually writing some tests. So we're immediately kind of breaking the flow a little bit, but that's all good. I mean, that's the very, as you already know, perhaps familiar, the nature of software development. So really, yeah, but what we are going to be doing and striving to do as we go through this is, just as I said, deeply explore that life cycle. All right. And then format-wise, already alluded to this a little bit. It's going to be 5 sessions. Bi-weekly, it already got asked in the chat. So bi-weekly, just to stress, that's every other week. We're going to be posing some challenges and exercises in between weeks. We originally were going back and forth. We should do it weekly, and then we ended up landing with bi-weekly, just to give you a bit of a buffer of time. For those that have day jobs or other plenty of other things going on, which I'm sure you do. We will also be this will be at the end as well, how you can get connected to the Truffle community Slack that we have, and we'll be setting up a dedicated channel for this, so you can literally ask questions on the fly. It may be a bit of a async answer, may not immediately, but we'll get to it. And we'll also most likely we will be putting on some dedicated office hour times, and where we can jump on and screen share as needed as well. A big emphasis as well, again, already alluded to this, that learning by doing, getting hands-on. In this session, as mentioned, we'll be literally jumping into a Amal's screen and really building some, getting hands-on, but probably stating the obvious that the best way to learn is to do it yourself, with guidance, of course, and yeah, big emphasis on that. Okay, prerequisites for this series. We've listed a few here. Before I go through them, we just wanted to emphasize that it doesn't really matter. Don't panic if you're skimming down that list and seeing, gosh, I don't have perhaps 1 or 2 of these things, or you don't feel that you have. Firstly, we'll be sending out some materials on all these things and beyond, not just this list. But you can always ask questions and so on. This was just almost best thought of as an ideal prerequisites. And just to go through them briefly, ideally you have just a kind of at least a basic understanding of what a blockchain is. Doesn't have to be deep. And again, if you don't, it's okay. We'll help you fill those gaps. Same with a brief, sort of high level appreciation of the software development lifecycle. We've already seen that, or at least an interpretation of it in that flow diagram there. Again, don't worry if you don't feel you do have that. Again, this third one's a bit more, perhaps scary if you feel you don't have prior programming experience. Again, don't worry. And ideally, you've perhaps got a little bit, perhaps tinkered with things here and there. Obviously, if you have more than that, that's great. But again, we'll be, here to guide you and kind of work with you through that. And lastly, just again, ideally at least a basic appreciation of Git and GitHub, because we'll be, using both of those as a means of kind of giving you the code samples, and again, some of the concepts there, like checking out a branch and so on, we'll be kind of utilizing, as part of the exercises and so on. But just to stress, we'll be sending out materials for these, or links, to things, and we also have good docs on big parts of this. So cool. So yeah, main takeaway on this one is don't panic. Anything to add, Amal?
Yeah. Please don't panic.
Yep. Awesome. Thank you. All right. Before we jump into the first part of this session, or this episode, there was a poll, as Shay mentioned, and I think it was available prior to the session starting. So I think a lot of you have already answered it, and I did actually see that. I saw some of the responses. If you haven't yet and you just quickly want to do it, you should see a poll link. I think, Shay, you alluded to this as well at the start, but just kind of in case you missed it.
At the bottom, yeah.
At the bottom, yeah. Kind of directly below Shay, almost, to where I'm seeing you floating.
Somewhere over there, right.
Point down that way, I think.
It says polls, yeah.
Polls with I see a 4 next to it, maybe because I haven't answered it. And yeah, really, this was just to kind of get a flavor of where you guys were all at. So we'll just go through them briefly now. So who has a wallet? Most folks do. Few folks don't. Man, as all of these, again, it's okay if you don't. Really don't panic. Have you written a smart contract before? Probably 3/4 have. That just shifted in real time there. Again, no worries if you haven't. That's one of the key things of this course. Yeah. Have you ever deployed something to a public network? And by public network, we mean either a test net or a mainnet in the context, in the case of Ethereum. And again, in most cases there, it's looking like most people haven't. So that's good, because that's, again, one of the things we're going to be doing. And then there's a kind of deviation or variation on the answer to that one. Yes, and I'm interested in forked sandboxes for testing. We'll get to that. Don't worry if that means nothing to you right now. And lastly, have you used tools in the Truffle Suite before? So most people have, some haven't. Cool, alrighty. Yeah, thank you for kind of filling these in, guys.
So most Truffle teams will be new to a lot of people here, it looks like. So
yeah, that's great.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, cool. All right. So yeah, again, we'll emphasize this a lot, but really the goal of this is to get wherever you currently are at, in terms of experience level, and just get you accelerated forward comfortably. Okay. All right. Now, one thing you'll note, and I get a bit carried away with this, is putting in probably too many random images and emojis into the slide. So apologies for that in advance. But anyway, we're now jumping into this specific episode. Now we've broken it down into 2 parts. Again, already mentioned this. First part is going to be a bit more theory, hence the graphic on the left, getting you thinking. We're going to cover 2 things. One is just really around the paradigm of decentralized applications. The goal with that is going to be just to kind of sow seeds of thought. Some of them you might already have an appreciation of, others maybe not. And then we'll also very briefly introduce the Truffle Suite. And that's going to be super brief, because we're going to be putting the emphasis on kind of learning by getting hands-on. And then, I say part 2, the hands-on bit is going to be the image on the right, which just made me smile, kind of turning you into Uber hacker, 80s hacker there. Cool. All right, so let's jump into part 1 to get you thinking first, and exploring the concept or the paradigm of decentralized apps. Oops, going the wrong way. There we go. Okay, so a lot of words on this slide, also a few emojis, and just wanted to touch on the key characteristics of the paradigm. And starting from the middle, the first thing a decentralized app brings to bear as a kind of feature of it is trust. I've got a little sparkle next to it. And what it really does in that is helps facilitate trust between parties where perhaps it doesn't exist. I may or may not trust, someone I've never met before, don't even know who they are. How can you bring about trust between myself and that person, or yourself and that person? It's pretty hard. Or people that partially, semi-trusted parties, perhaps businesses, where they trust each other to some degree, but perhaps also working in competition as well. So that's one thing, and again, I won't get into the how so much yet, because that starts to get us into the technology. But that's definitely something from a characteristic perspective it brings to bear. Similarly, or going round now clockwise, starting in the top right, from a kind of application perspective, or Dapp, decentralized app, however you want to refer to it. Characteristically, they are unstoppable and uncensorable. And I personally love this quote. I think it's taken from the Ethereum Foundation, and hence the boxing glove emoji for this one. And really what that means, because what you're building on from an infrastructural perspective is decentralized, it kind of can't be taken down. It can't be stopped. If I just take it off of one node, it's still there, it's still everywhere. By design, it's what comes with with the paradigm. And again, when you compare and contrast that to the centralized world, if I deploy something to centralized infrastructure, it can be pretty unstoppable, but it can be censored. For example, if the company I'm hosting it with decides for whatever reason they don't like me or don't like my company, or government wants to wade in or does wade in, they can take it down. In the case of this paradigm, that's not possible, which is pretty interesting. Carrying on round, characteristic wise. Amal and I kind of talked a little bit about this one and how to frame it. And we kept it in, even though perhaps it was a little bit kind of hard to convey. But the things you build and deploy can intrinsically store kind of real value, real assets, and very easily as well, which is interesting. So I could write a contract right now, deploy it. You could send Ether or tokens or units of value of some kind to that. And similarly, myself as a user, the bearer of an account or a public-private key, can also, store these things and send them between parties, with some of the characteristics we've just talked about as well. And there's no, no one can get in the way of that. There's no gatekeepers, no people saying you can't do that, etc. Anything to add, Amal, so far on these ones?
No, Kevin, I think you nailed it. The ability to anyone to participate without being censored by a gatekeeper or anyone, you just have access to it.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, so carrying on round, I'll kind of gloss over the next one because it will be coming up later from a kind of governance perspective. Very interesting though, because it allows things that you build to be governed in a decentralized manner, but we'll talk more about that one later. The final thing, as we kind of come around to the top left, is how you bring these things to life is through something called smart contracts. And it sounded like earlier, a good number of folks have perhaps already played around a little bit with them. And these things called smart contracts store both the data that we're storing, or can at least store the data, as well as that business logic that you create to work with that data or manipulate that data. And again, we'll be getting into that into a lot of depth as we go through this series. All right, a few more things to kind of seed you with from a development standpoint. And these are new things, or not new things in the broad sense of building software, writing software, but new twists or new things you'll need to consider when building on top of this paradigm, often referred to as Web3. I haven't used that term yet. First one is user identity. Now, again, that exists obviously in Web 2.0, or if I'm building a centralized application, it's a very common thing to do, to have a users table or collection and store username and password hash and so on in that, or hash password. However, and in essence, I kind of own that data if I'm doing it in a centralized system. In the decentralized world, the user fully owns that identity. So again, that's something you need to consider. The ramifications of that, and we'll be getting to it as we go through. That it's different in that sense. Similarly, when users are interacting with the service that you build, the app, etc., there's some additional characteristics that you'll need to start thinking about from a user experience perspective, e.g., the front end or the UI that you build. First one being transaction fees. There's nuance there. You can offset them or absorb them yourself, but in the kind of default mode of operating, they will be charged to interact with your application by design. It might sound a little odd if you're new to this space, and that manifests as something called gas, which they would need to pay to essentially update data or mutate state on the chain, and that also takes time. So put down latency here as well. That anything that to actually update can take a bit of time. So again, you need to bake that into your UI, that it's not going to be as instantaneous as in traditional application or Web 2.0 application. Next up is governance. Again, touched on that a little bit on the previous slide, or jumped over it somewhat. But what the things you build, you can kind of still own them as a service, but it's not uncommon in this paradigm to decentralize the ownership of a service. So people that are vested in it through perhaps ownership of a token of some kind have a say in the evolution of that product or that platform or that service. And also, if you can redefine the small print here, you can also see the word upgradability as well. And that's something you would need to consider up front, because what you build, if you do want it to evolve and you want to be able to upgrade those things, you need to think about that in advance as well. Otherwise, you won't. Things are, once deployed, if you haven't sort of considered that or enabled that in quotes, then it won't be upgradable by design. Anything more to add on those first three before I jump through, Amal?
No, we're good.
I'm good. Cool. Okay, so the last two on this list from a consideration standpoint, the fourth one is security. So obviously security is always a consideration on whatever you're doing, of course, whether it's centralized or otherwise. The reason we called it out here is because, as we've already alluded to, that things that you build can store and do store real value, be that a user account, or manifested in a wallet. We'll talk more about that, or a contract that you've deployed. As mentioned, they can store real things. So if there is weaknesses or vulnerabilities in the things in the contracts that you write, that can be pretty dire, have some dire consequences. It does happen, sadly. The vulnerabilities get detected that weren't discovered before it was deployed, and real value can be drained. Real money can be drained out of these things. If that's something as you've leveraged as a feature. So the emphasis on security shifts a little, well, potentially quite a lot, depending on how you look at it. There's a big emphasis on getting things secure up front, which is arguably a good thing, I guess, from a practice perspective. And you do that, you might get a third-party auditor to review the contracts, do things like bug bounties, as you kind of get towards launching it, in a kind of real-world manner. And then the last one, again, seeds of thoughts to consider is the cost of storage. Both data in a generic sense is quite expensive to store on chain, store on the blockchain, within the contracts. You can and will do it. You kind of need to do it to have any real functionality, but it doesn't come cheaply, at least as cheaply as if you're storing on central, like AWS S3 or in any of the kind of very sort of ubiquitous storage layers that you might be used to if you're coming from a kind of Web 2 world. The good news is you don't need to store everything on chain. There's plenty of other options, and decentralized options as well. Something you may have heard of called IPFS, which is characteristically similar to all the things we've been talking about, but is based around storage, and much cheaper. Either free or much cheaper, depending on the nuance, and we can get to that. Cool. All right. So that's some considerations to just be chewing on as we go through this. Next up is just
1 second.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to point out in security audits, this is an important part of what you're going to do as a smart contract developer. Is how do you manage the operations of that? Recently there was a case where a contract was audited, and they got signed off by the auditing company, but the developers went ahead afterwards and changed the code and used code that was unaudited. So things like that we didn't have to think about this before, but now it has to be part of the operations mindset. And these are some of the exciting things that we'll have to challenge. We'll have to solve, challenges we'll have to solve. So, yeah.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Amal. Cool. All right. So next up, and these again, just seeds of thought for now, more than anything else, just to kind of gently introduce you to the kind of paradigm. This one, looking at it from a kind of architectural perspective. On the left-hand side, we can see, just a traditional Web 2.0 architecture. So going kind of top down from the green boxes, e.g. the interfaces, be that a browser, be that a mobile application, typically talk to an API, which in turn, is brought to life through a web server and, business logic and all the things we know, and then persistence through or to a database, relational or otherwise. Very common, very tried and tested, paradigm, platform, however you want to refer to it, and all good. And that will continue to exist. It's not to say, this new world, is going to just supplant that immediately or anything like that. But that's the traditional kind of Web 2 way. Web 3, kind of by contrast, and there's many ways you can slice this. So this is just kind of one of them. Is similar, at least going from the top down. So users will still use a browser, with the caveat that it needs to be Dapp enabled. So they might have a web wallet, something called, very popular one is something called MetaMask that you can plug into, to your browser, and that will kind of give you a wallet that you can, use. And ultimately all of that, really what you're doing there is using that to sign transactions that you send to the network. And then, similarly, there's Dapp browsers for, mobile devices, same thing. So, from an end user perspective, it's similar. There's some other considerations that they will need to be aware of. Do they need a wallet and, and so on. But then it gets a bit different. So you still, send transactions to an interface, in this case, an RPC interface, but it's sending it to a node on the network. Now, you might either be, that might be a node you're hosting yourself or via a gateway. Some really popular ones, one called Infura. If you're familiar with Cloudflare, they have one, and a good number of others out there. And then, that's the kind of, an entry point for the transactions that are sent to be replicated out across the network. And we won't get to that. We'll park that for the moment. The takeaway here really was just the kind of mappings of where things exist in Web 2 to where they exist in Web 3. So looking at the kind of orange box on the left with the business logic, that and the data, I should say, both map to contracts. Both kind of commingle together. In that's the Ethereum icon on the left, but this would apply to other programmable blockchains as well. That logic and state or storage of data is kind of unified together. And to some degree, the replication and network things to some degree can be abstracted from you. It's good to have an appreciation of them, and we'll be going through that in this series. But really, the takeaway here is that logic and data are kind of mingled together into, as we'll see in a moment, a smart contract, and that kind of handles both of them for you, which is pretty nice. Cool. Just pause there if there's anything you want to add, Amal. Otherwise, keep going. All right. So last kind of theory paradigm slide here is, so what can you kind of build with all this stuff? And we just kind of listed a few things of the types of apps and services that we're seeing emerge or have emerged in the last few years. This isn't a brand new space anymore, although it's still relatively young. And this, by the way, isn't meant to be a definitive list of everything that's going on. And then reason we want to call these things out is because if you are kind of new to this space or you've got an idea for doing something, I personally think it's important to sort of not just map from kind of the traditional kind of Web 2 way of doing things directly over to Web 3. I want to build a social network just like Facebook, in a decentralized way. There's been plenty of projects, or are still projects, that are kind of doing things like that. But it's important to think differently, because the paradigm forces you to in some ways, for some of the reasons we just talked about. The cost of transactions and so on. But what it does do, which is super exciting, is it bubbles up, new ways of doing things. And just to pick out a few of them, I say this isn't meant to be a definitive list. First one being like digital assets. So you can, very, very easy to kind of manifest a digital asset, like a unique asset that can be traded, sent around, all the characteristics we talked about, unstoppably, uncensorably, and so on. Now they can be uniquely, inherently digital, or they could be, the term that I've seen bandied around is digital twin, so where it maps to a physical, real-world asset as well, and that kind of the digital representation is kind of mapped to that physical representation. Taking that further, what we're seeing emerge, and again, if you've been looking, playing in the space or working in the space a bit, hard to ignore, is this concept of decentralized finance, or DeFi as it's often shortened to, as a counterbalance, counterpoint to CeFi, or centralized finance. And this is arguably one of the kind of hottest and wildest areas in the space right now, I would say. And really what it is financial services, financial instruments, many of which coming from centralized equivalents, or at least taken inspiration from, but they're kind of bubbling up and being explored and experimented with, on top of this platform or this paradigm. And what's so amazing, I think, is just they're intrinsically programmable. If you build a service, be that an exchange, you can program against it directly. It's a feature of the system. Versus, think to how you might want to program against centralized finance. You can potentially need to use Stripe or Braintree or all these kind of like Band-Aid type solutions to, allow you to program against, centralized finance as a entity or as a thing. So it's super exciting. I mean, it is crazy right now. If you haven't been taking much notice, dip in, search for DeFi, look at news and stuff. It's really amazing. Similarly, governance and identity. We talked about decentralized governance. That's really starting to catch hold. Including some of the services we've just referred to. Like a lot of these DeFi services are decentrally governed. So if you have a stake in them, then you get a say in the direction of where it's going and kind of changing parameters and things within it. And same with identity, not just your identity as a kind of public key, as a string of characters to represent you who you are, but more details of your identity about intrinsically who you are, stored on chain, immutably so. So no one can ever take that away from you. And personally, unlike a centralized identity, which you're at the mercy of a government, which theoretically could take it away. So again, very fascinating. And then the final bucket here is just new ways. I already touched on this, but just new ways of doing things. Be that things like the way supply chains operate, or managing health, gaming, etc. Anything to add, Amal?
Yeah, these are all fascinating. I don't think we touched on gaming besides CryptoKitties, but the economies around gaming, like these massively multiplayer games, game assets. It's quite interesting, and married with AR and VR, there are some really exciting times ahead. Cool.
Yeah. Thanks, Amal. All right. So a couple, little shift of gears just to segue into the how now, building up to when we jump into actually getting hands-on with some stuff. So brief peek at the Truffle Suite for those that need a kind of refresher on it, or those that are brand new. And 10,000 feet view, what is Truffle Suite? Really, in a quote, this is from a website, helping someone, a developer that has an idea for a decentralized app. So, thinking about all the things we've just touched on, to the manifestation or the realization of that as comfortably as possible. And as as we've already touched on, and as we'll be exploring in this series, going through that life cycle and kind of having tools that help in that life cycle, as you both build it and then actually deploy it, and obviously test it, etc. first, and then actually monitor and kind of manage that as it evolves. So that's kind of our mission, or and the what of the Truffle Suite. Going to the next level of depth, or a little bit more depth. What is it? So it's a kind of a mocked or a complete mock of a blockchain environment. All the constructs that you need to be using and considering and so on are kind of baked into the tools. So everything from accounts, just quickly spinning them up that you can use to as part of your testing and development process, through to actual nodes, mining nodes, and the interfaces with which to deploy your contracts as you're building them and testing them and all the things, is all kind of within the suite of tools. And again, with that goal of helping you through that the life cycle, the development life cycle. Download wise, we've been around a few years now, so we've got healthy amount of downloads. Really think the takeaway there though is that the suite's very actively maintained. Majority of the tooling is open source. So the GitHub org username is Truffle Suite, if you want to check that out if you haven't already. And I say the majority just because Truffle Teams right now is closed source because it's a hosted SaaS product. Elements of that may, we may open source up over time, but everything else, particularly Truffle, which we'll be looking at shortly, is open source. And then who's using the tools? Our tools, companies you can see listed here, big, small, and so on. Okay, last slide, I think, before we segue over to hands-on. And just wanted to call out the CLI specifically here, because as you're aware, it's a suite of tools, so there's a bunch of different things. Reason we're just going to mention Truffle CLI here is because that's what we're going to be getting our hands on in a moment. So specifically, what is it? It's a command line tool that really focuses on the contract development lifecycle. So other tools, as we'll see, focus on different parts of that lifecycle. But Truffle itself, and just to kind of disambiguate, it is a bit confusing, I think, sometimes, because we're called Truffle Suite. And within the suite, there's something called Truffle, but there's other things. So just so there's not just Truffle, FYI. But we called out a few commands here that we're going to be looking at momentarily. For example, or the ones I think we're going to be looking at is a knit, which isn't listed here, which will spin up a boilerplate for us. And then we're going to be writing some tests. As you can see, there's lots and lots of other commands baked into the tool. And I put more to come here just because, Ganache, Drizzle, and Teams are things we're going to be covering in other episodes and kind of gracefully injecting them into the hands-on pieces that we do. So with that, let's shift over to simple storage, to the hands-on. We're going to be doing something called simple storage. And specifically, what are we going to be looking at? And the steps that we're going to be going through right now are scaffolding an empty project. So Amal's going to be literally doing this live. We're then going to plan. So if you just, thanks Shay for jumping back to that one. Kind of go through that planning stage. Very, very simple, a bit contrived, but we'll go through the what we're going to try and do. We're then going to use TDD, or test-driven development, or that approach. So we're going to start writing some tests. So the test stage, if you can see on the slide here, kind of curved around. And finally, you're going to try and make our tests pass. So we're going to actually start some coding and iterate towards our goal of building simple storage. Okay, so with that, maybe we get Amal's screen up. And over to you, Amal, for.
Sure. Thanks, guys. Can everyone see the screen? Just want to make sure things are okay. Kevin?
Yep. Yeah, sorry, yes, I can. Yeah.
Give us a thumbs up, or if there's any problem with seeing it or any audio, please let me know in the chat. Thanks.
All right. So that was a lot of material. I talked about the ecosystem, really high level. Kevin talked about blockchain. He mentioned accounts. He mentions contracts. And it's a lot of stuff, a lot of things. How do you contextualize it, and where do you start? It can be overwhelming, right? If you want to do is implement your business logic, how do you get started? So we're going to do this exercise, and I want you to keep in mind, the code isn't important. What's really important is showing you the process and how to proceed when things don't go as you expected, and just show you how Truffle, the right mindset, testing can be a safety net / training wheels to learning. And once you get past this and you start relying on it, you'll start building up intuition and get to know this domain really well. So that being said, let's jump in. But first, what are we doing? We're going to try to build a smart contract that has a value that we can store and we can retrieve. As simple as it gets. But I hope to show you that as we do this, what Truffle does and what Truffle brings to smart contract development that's beneficial. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is scaffold out a project. In this folder, there's nothing much for Truffle, just my notes. And what I'm going to do is scaffold it out by running the truffle init command.
Amal, is it possible for you to increase the font size on your screen a little bit?
Sure. How's that?
Yeah, looks good, Amal.
Thank you.
All right, so let's talk about what just happened. So, as you know, there are all these concepts that go into making something happen on blockchain, and Truffle starts you with the basics that you need. The first thing we have is a migration contract that'll handle the migration logic. Don't worry about what migration is. We'll get to it in further episodes. But if you have questions, please ask, and we'll get back to you. It also includes a migration script. This migration script takes something called compilation assets and takes that onto a network or a blockchain. And finally, we have something called Truffle config. This is the place where you can customize how your Truffle project behaves and what you want to do. For this lesson, we don't really have to worry about this too much, but these are the things that you get with Truffle Edit. So what are we going to do? Let me just close this. So we want to introduce some sort of behavior to the system. And what is that behavior? The behavior is, the first thing is we want to have a contract that we can play around with. And then if we introduce it to the system, how do we test it? These are things that Truffle helps you with. So I usually like to start out with a test. So there's a command, Truffle create test. And we'll call it simple storage. And this creates a test right here. Just gonna modify it because we're using a different syntax. Sorry about that. It's one or the other, not both. Don't worry about this. This is my mistake. Anyway, so sorry, Kevin. So we have a test, and let's look at what this test does. It grabs something from this artifact object, and we're saying simple storage. Well, we know what simple storage is in terms of what we just started. We're writing a contract called simple storage. So this is giving us a representation of that simple storage that we want to use. And this test is going forward and saying, hey, give me the deployed version of that contract that we just wrote, or we should be writing. And if we were to test it, Truffle test, we'll see, unsurprisingly, that it fails. But this is where I like to, when I'm learning something new, I like to go about it in this way. Some very small changes, try to run it and see what the system says. And here we can see like, it's trying to compile, it compiles migration the migrations contract, and then it errors out because it couldn't find simple storage, which is fine, right? We didn't create that. So let's add this contract to our system. And we use the Truffle command line for that. Truffle create contract. And if we come up to the contracts folder, we'll see there is something called simple storage. So this is kind of cool. We just scaffolded a test and we introduced a simple storage contract. And before we even look at it, let's see what happens if we do Truffle test again. This is pretty interesting. We have a new error. It compiled the contract, it found 2, The first was migration. The second is simple storage. And it failed because simple storage has not been deployed to a detected network. That's interesting. Kevin, do you care to speculate or enlighten us on what's happening?
Good question. Yeah, no, my speculation, guess is that we haven't actually deployed it to a network.
I would say
migrated it. I mean, to use a synonym.
Yeah. So what happened here in this process is that we have a contract that was compiled, and the Truffle system framework is trying to take that output and put it on a network, but it doesn't know how. So we have to tell it how to do that. And the way we do that is by adding a migration script in this folder. Again, a lot of cut and pasting here, but the idea is to highlight the process and not worry too much about the code. So let's try testing again. Struggle. That's how I feel. All right. So this is pretty cool. We just created a contract, and we were able to compile it, deploy it, and test it, interact with it on the most basic level. That's a lot of stuff. We don't have to worry about the network. We don't need to know anything about that. We didn't need to know how to actually get that binary representation onto the network. We didn't have to worry about compiling. It just does it for you. Of course, you can go in and configure it to your needs as you need to do more sophisticated things. But as a starting point, this is fantastic. So let's talk about adding some more. Let's look at our contract that was generated for us. I don't like that orange line because of my editor, so I'm going to just bump that version. And let's add a test. Let's add a test to see what the initial state of our value is. So give me a moment. Copy this and go to this test. I'm just going to remove this test and replace it with the same one. So this is the first one that just made sure it was deployed. I'm just going to close that. And we added a new test. And what this test is saying, it's quite interesting. It's saying, give me an instance of the simple storage contract that was deployed just for this test. And I want to get the value of a particular state. I want my contract to have this function. And I want it to know that when it's initially deployed, it should be 0. So let's see. I added that test, and let's execute it. All right. As you start writing contracts and start developing in Solidity, you're going to see these errors a lot. So it's really helpful to go through this very basic thing. I know some of you from our survey that said that you've written smart contracts before, and some of you haven't. But it's really important to learn how to look at the output and intuit about what's happening, to build your intuition so that when you see something, you have a really good idea of what's happening. And what this is telling me is that we're trying to invoke this method call on this JavaScript object, and it doesn't exist. And it doesn't exist because we haven't written it. So let me go add that to the contract. going to hop into my notes for the contract. And I am just going to copy these two things. And I'm just going to put it right here. Put it right here. And so what does this do? This introduces a uint 256 public state that we are going to call stored data. And we are defining a function called a public function or view that is named get stored data that just returns stored data. Like I said, the code isn't important. What's important is the process.
Just to interject there as well, and to refer back to that architectural diagram that we had, this is both essentially the storage, that Amal was referring to there, that unsigned integer, and the means with which you can retrieve that storage. Essentially some logic in a sense, albeit incredibly simple logic.
Yeah. So let's do a truffle test. All right. So looking at the test results, we can see we have a contract that was deployed, and we have verified that its initial value is 0. So if we in the next step in the process is to add more behavior, I want to be able to set the value and then inspect that value. So let's go ahead and do that. Let me find that in our test notes. So I have it here in functionality. Let's look at what this is doing. Yeah, so it should store the value 42. That's what we're trying to do. We grab an instance, get the current deployed instance, and then we say, hey, we want to set the storage to this value, and we're going to use this account as the identity and owner of the wallet to sign this transaction. Then we're going to invoke the get stored data to verify that we actually got our value. So 42, and let's just run it. Tets. All right, so interesting. Reference error accounts is not defined in this particular test that we just wrote. So what that means is there's no accounts, right? But this is an interesting thing. When Truffle is running a test, as Kevin presented earlier, you need to manage identity. And if you're going to test a contract, you need to manage or mock that identity. And this is something that Truffle does for you. It has a provider, which is a test chain that gets spun up every time you run Truffle test. And one of the things, among other things, it starts the chain, and it creates a bunch of accounts, 10 by default, and it pre-funds those with fake ether that you can run your test with. And the way it injects it into the test system is by sending it as the first argument to this function here. This is the entry point. So after Truffle spins up the provider, it gets the accounts and puts it into this function and say, hey, go run your tests. So I just made that change, and let's run this. Set stored data is not a function. All right, let's go look at this.
Amal, sorry to interject. I just want to, coming up on the hour, is this something exercise-wise we can continue the exercise and conversation on the Slack community after as well?
We can.
Okay.
I should be done in another minute.
Okay. All right. No problem.
All right. So let's get the set storage. Let's go to the contract. Let's add this in. And let's run test. SS instance. Kevin, I need your help. What's going on, man?
Oh, go back to the test?
Yeah.
Oh, you didn't save that file, Amal, I don't think.
Oh, no. Oh, there we go. Pure programming. You pure at it.
A little
Yeah.
things.
Saving.
File not saved. Yes. Thank you, too.
Ah, but here we go. This one should be an easy fix. 42 is not 420. I am going to make that one pass.
It's always the syntax stuff.
Yeah. Especially with me.
We
Don't
will be
trust
getting
my
to
code.
everybody's questions, by the way. Thank you for hanging on there.
Yeah, so I really encourage you guys to play around with this. We're going to share this with, and one of the things you could do is, just to try it out, is some of you who are new, you could try just getting the current exercise to run. And then for other more adventurous, is try to introduce like some role-based access so that only an owner could modify the state, the stored value. I know some of you might think this is really simple, but the really important part is to go through this process, look at the output, infer what's happening, and just experience smart contracting development with training wheels that has your back. You'll be very productive if you follow this procedure and this process. Kevin?
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, there was a question from Maria, which I think Shay answered. Where will this be shared? Yeah, just to reemphasize that, we'll be putting this out on our Slack community or a Slack channel specific. Well, so we have Truffle community Slack, and then we'll be setting up a channel within this that will get you all on, and we'll be putting it up on GitHub. So as Amal mentioned, we're just re-emphasizing the same thing. Goal is to, if you're brand new to this, is to just get it running, and actually run Truffle test, see it, maybe tinker with it, get it to fail, and then see it pass. And then there's the stretch one that will be in there as a comment that Amal mentioned, whereas, kind of the role-based access side of things. And again, we're going to be on the channel kind of monitoring that to answer any questions that come up as you work through that.
Yes, thank you, Amal and Kevin. This was amazing. And this is a great exercise, a great one to get you guys kind of get your feet wet and just really test all the aspects. Kevin, can you click to the next slide?
Yep.
Community after next steps. So we're going to wrap up now, and we're going to go into the questions that you guys have. Thank you. We have a few really good questions, Kevin and Amal, already queued up. As we mentioned, the best way to continue this conversation and have an ongoing chat with Kevin and Amal on these exercises each episode, because they're going to continue to get more hands-on. Join our Slack community, and we'll have a dedicated channel there, but we'll find you there for sure, and we can basically continue the conversation of these demos. And then, the screen is a little pixelated. Hopefully you guys can see that okay. It's basically truffle.co/truffle-community. I also put that in the chat. And in general, we really love to get you in there so that we can continue conversations with showcasing your projects under our Built with Truffle campaign that we'll be launching soon. And all that good stuff. So we'd love to see you there. All right, so let's take some questions here. The one that has the most upvotes is, what are the differences between REST APIs in Web 2, and then JSON RPC in Web 3?
I can start with that one. So yeah, REST API is, or RESTful APIs as a paradigm is a kind of prescribed pattern for defining interactions to an application, a web-based application. Just to kind of summarize that a little, and you would create that yourself, and define the routes and so on. JSON RPC and Web3, on the other hand, is a similar in the sense you're still sending requests either over HTTP or WebSocket to a node in this case. So it's similar in conceptually there, but with Web3, it's a predefined client-side library with different implementations of it, where you would be sending transactions to the node and kind of interacting with it through that. And Web3 has a bunch of different kind of functions and constructs that map to what we've just seen, like getting accounts or sending a transaction and so on. So conceptually, it's similar. You're still kind of writing, reading from a server of sorts, or a gateway in the context of Web3. But beyond that, it's pretty different. Not the greatest answer. I'll let Amal kind of fill in some blanks there, things I might have overlooked.
No, I think it's a good start, Kevin. The thing that I go to most is that more people know how to use HTTP or RESTful APIs, and JSON RPC is just another format that's used by Web3 under the hood. There is really no advantage. It's just that most of Ethereum or blockchain is using this RPC method. There really conceptually no big difference that I can think of.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys. The next one, we're going to try to go through these quickly. And if we don't get through all the questions, hopefully we will. But if we don't, we will post those answers on the Slack community too, as well. Second one, is it possible? Basically, they want to know if it's possible to explain the steps, how the VS Code is all set up and configured for Truffle. Is there a quick way to kind of explain? Because you kind of jumped right into it, Amal. I think that's more about a setup. How do we get to get started with what you showed in the example?
Oh, look at me explaining how to use VS Code.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty straightforward, but maybe for people who aren't as experienced.
Yeah, so what I did was I just really installed the Solidity plugin, and everything else just worked. The commands I ran were in the terminal, the integrated terminal that comes with your VS Code. So if you had Truffle installed, it's as simple as doing npm-i -g install Truffle. If you're on a Linux-based system for Windows, there's a little bit more to it. But that's really all you need to get it up and going.
Thanks, Amal. The other question is, what is the difference between Remix IDE and Truffle Suite? What's the main distinction, I guess, if there is one?
Oh, there is one, yeah.
There's plenty,
yeah.
yes.
Mal and I think we even had a slide on this that we didn't end up keeping in. Remix, at a high level, I think is great from a learning standpoint, in terms of just dropping in, Solidity and just tinkering around there. What it lacks, I think, is, some of a big number of the workflow things that we've been, kind of work through there. What I think where we, sort of how we perceive it, and they're both complement. There's some degree of being complementary, but I think Truffle, at least as we see it, is better from a kind of process, more kind of robust development workflow, and then Remix is good from a learning, kind of just dropping in Solidity, kind of hacking around on it perspective. That would be my kind of quick answer, at least.
Okay, that sounds good. All right, we're going to jump to the next one because we have a couple more. Can you say something? Well, actually, I wonder if we should jump to this one where we have, can you say something about the advent of Ethereum 2.0 and how Truffle Suite might be affected by that?
I think the easy answer, as much as I know about ETH 2.0, is not, hugely different from a development perspective. I know there's channels internally where we, are exploring that out, and we can come back with a more robust answer on that one, I think.
Okay.
A lot of, unless there's anything you want to add. I'm also conscious of time as well. Not to
yes. Okay, sounds good. Kevin, can you click to the very last screen, the last slide, as we're kind of end on this last question?
Yeah.
Thank you. And then the last question we have here for you guys, and there's a few comments that are coming in on it. Basically, it's posing, if you could see that yourselves, it's basically posing an idea of, if you have 100 contracts that should be migrated for some CLI applications, you start Truffle Migrate, reset, and after separated 100 JS files migration, if you have some updates on a couple of contracts, let's say 20 of them, I'm trying to like kind of convert their question.
Maybe sorry, Shay, to jump in. Maybe with this one, we can revert to the Truffle chat, the Slack channel.
Slack channel, that's a great idea.
For these, and we can, start some threads on these.
Yeah, Ferdy, we're going to go ahead and answer your question on the Slack channel. So we'll bring that over there, and then kind of, hopefully you're there. Make sure to join, and then we'll ping you to kind of continue the conversation. Thank you again for that question. Final question, guys. Oh no, actually that's been resolved. I think we're good with questions. All right, awesome. So like I said, we'll put that question on the Slack and we'll finish that. And also join the Slack community for talking over the exercise that they did today, the simple storage exercise. We have this last screen here, like I mentioned. If you are already registered for TruffleCon, and it was a free registration, if you upgrade to a VIP ticket experience, which you still can, or the Truffle Chocolate Flight Tasting, you'll have a chance to win a kind of a special one-of-a-kind truffle swag that we have not, is totally exclusive, as well as a chance for a one-on-one Zoom session with our head of product, Josh Quintal, if that's something that you're interested in. Also, just in general, we would love to see you this year. We have a lot of great topics, including this one, but blockchain for social good, enterprise, DeFi, all that good stuff. So you won't want to miss it. So definitely register for free, and we'll see you there. Okay, guys? Anything else, Kevin and Amal, that you'd like to add? I know they're anxious about the next episode, but maybe just give a general gist of what to expect, and we'll announce when that next episode will be on the Slack community as well.
Sorry, I've got background noise right here. So okay. Yeah, no. So I was kind of muting myself. I think first and foremost, get on the Slack channel because we'll be starting to drop more stuff there. We'll also put the link to the Git repo for the exercise and the stuff that we just covered as well. And then next week, kind of continuing through that life cycle, and it'll be kind of say apologies, but it was a bit somewhat slide heavier this session. That was more just to give a bit of background and stuff. That will be way less in the next one. Next few will be kind of more jumping straight into the code and kind of iterating and so on, just to set expectations. Yeah. But really focused on the life cycle.
Yeah, some more testing, but like you said. And then it's probably going to be in a couple weeks rather than next week. So, but either way, you're registered on Crowdcast, you'll get notified. And if you're in the Slack community, you'll get notified. So again, thank you so much. We are going to share out the recording of this. So you'll be able to find it on the Slack community as well as through Crowdcast, as well as on our YouTube channel. So plenty of places. And we hope to see you on the next session or the next episode. Thank you again, everybody. Thank you, Amal and Kevin, for a great webinar.
Yeah, thank you too. Thank you, Shay. Yeah, thanks, guys. Yeah. See you in 2 weeks and before that on the Slack channel.